This is Jacob Friedman.
I'm very pleased to share that President Xi in our meeting today has committed to ensuring visa-free access for Canadians traveling to China.
Most people saw this headline and probably thought it was just another foreign policy update, the kind you skim past on your phone and forget 5 minutes later. Canada and China talked. Some tariffs might come down. Travel might get easier. Fine. But if you stop there, you miss what is actually happening, and more importantly, why this moment matters in a much bigger way than a visa policy or a canola deal, because this is not just about Canada warming relations with China. It is about how middle powers are quietly recalibrating their place in a world where American dominance is no longer guaranteed, and where economic survival increasingly means refusing to be trapped inside someone else's geopolitical feud. If you live in North America, you have been trained to see China through a very specific lens. Everything is framed as confrontation, threat, rivalry, or moral test. So when a country like Canada takes a step toward Beijing, the reflexive reaction is suspicion. What are they giving up? Who is selling out? What values are being compromised? But that framing tells you very little about the actual pressures governments are facing right now, and even less about who pays the price when diplomacy collapses into permanent hostility. On the surface, the story is simple. After years of strained relations, Canadian and Chinese leaders met in Beijing and announced a reset. The most headline-friendly piece is that Canadians will be able to travel to China without a visa. For business travelers, students, researchers, and families, that is not a symbolic gesture. It removes cost, delay, and friction that have quietly frozen people-to-people contact for years. Alongside that, both sides signaled a major shift on trade, particularly around agriculture. China is expected to lower tariffs on Canadian canola, reopening what used to be one of the most important export markets for Canadian farmers. That is the official story. Cooperation is back. Dialogue is restored. Everyone smiles for the cameras and talks about mutual benefit. But if you stop there, you miss the deeper reality. This is not just about fixing a bilateral relationship. It is about Canada trying to escape a dangerous level of economic dependence on the United States at a moment when trade has become a weapon rather than a shared system. And it is about China using selective openness to pull countries away from a Washington-centered worldview without having to say so out loud. For years, Canada learned the hard way what it means to be caught in the middle of great power politics. When relations with China soured, it was not politicians who absorbed the shock. It was farmers who lost markets overnight. It was exporters scrambling to reroute supply chains. It was universities cutting exchange programs. It was small businesses discovering that geopolitics can destroy livelihoods without ever announcing itself at your doorstep. The tariffs on canola were not abstract punishment. They were economic pain deliberately concentrated in rural communities that had very little to do with diplomatic standoffs. So when the Canadian Prime Minister talks about restoring and even surpassing previous trade levels, that is not rhetorical optimism. It is an admission that the old strategy of quietly aligning every major economic decision with U.S. priorities left Canada exposed. Diversification is not ideological. It is defensive. It is about making sure that when one partner decides to pull a lever, your entire economy does not lurch in response. The visa-free travel announcement carries a similar logic. It is easy to dismiss it as a soft gesture, but people-to-people exchange is one of the first things sacrificed when governments drift into Cold War postures. When travel collapses, misunderstanding fills the vacuum. Academic cooperation dries up. Cultural exchange becomes propaganda, and ordinary people start seeing each other only through headlines and talking points. Reopening that channel is not about endorsing another government. It is about refusing to let suspicion become the default condition of international life. What makes this moment especially revealing is the timing. The United States is once again flirting with aggressive tariffs, protectionism, and economic nationalism. Trade is framed less as mutual gain and more as leverage. In that environment, countries like Canada are being forced to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when your closest ally treats trade as a loyalty test? What happens when your economic stability depends on the mood swings of another country's domestic politics? And what happens if you never build alternatives? This is where the media framing often fails. The story gets reduced to whether Canada is being too friendly with China or whether China is using economic incentives to gain influence. Those questions are not wrong, but they are incomplete. The more important question is why so many countries feel they need to hedge in the first place. And that question leads you not to Beijing, but to a global system where rules are increasingly replaced by power and where smaller players have to maneuver carefully just to stay upright. What we are watching is not a sudden change of values. It is a recalculation of risk. And the people most invested in pretending this is just about visas and soybeans are the ones who benefit from keeping the deeper shift invisible. When you look at it that way, this reset starts to look less like a flirtation and more like a survival strategy. Canada is not choosing China over the United States. It is choosing not to be cornered. And that distinction matters because it tells you something uncomfortable about the current global order. We are living in a moment where alignment is no longer enough to guarantee stability. Loyalty does not protect you from tariffs. Shared values do not insure your farmers. Being a good ally does not stop your economy from becoming collateral damage. China understands this dynamic very well. It does not need to win an ideological argument to expand its influence. It just needs to be predictable where others are volatile. It needs to offer access where others offer conditions. That does not mean Beijing is acting out of altruism. This is strategic. Visa-free travel costs China very little and generates goodwill fast. Lowering tariffs on agricultural imports helps address domestic demand while signaling that punishment can be reversed if relations improve. It creates a contrast without ever having to say the quiet part out loud. Who benefits from this shift is not hard to see. Canadian agricultural producers who were locked out of one of their biggest markets stand to gain almost immediately. Exporters regain leverage. Universities and research institutions reopen doors that had quietly closed. Families split across borders find it easier to move. These are not elites jetting around the world. These are ordinary people whose lives were narrowed by diplomatic breakdown. But there are also people who lose something when countries stop treating global politics as a zero-sum loyalty contest. Hardliners who thrive on permanent tension lose a bit of oxygen. Media ecosystems built around constant threat narratives lose a clean storyline. Political actors who rely on fear of the other to mobilize support find it harder to explain why engagement did not lead to catastrophe. Normalization, even partial, undercuts the drama that powers a lot of modern political communication. This is where you start to see why the reaction to these talks has been so mixed. Some commentators frame the move as naive, as if diplomacy itself were a form of weakness. Others treat economic engagement as moral failure, as though trade automatically erases disagreement. Both framings flatten reality. Countries do not engage because they believe everything is fine. They engage because disengagement has costs, and those costs are not evenly distributed. Think about what disengagement actually looks like on the ground. It looks like a farmer watching prices collapse because a market vanished overnight. It looks like a graduate student abandoning a research opportunity because the visa process became impossible. It looks like a small exporter realizing that their entire business model depends on decisions made far outside their control. None of that shows up in fiery speeches about standing up to adversaries, but it shapes lives all the same. There is also a democratic angle here that rarely gets discussed. When foreign policy hardens into permanent hostility, decision-making becomes more centralized and less accountable. Emergency logic takes over. Security concerns justify opacity. Trade decisions get framed as national defense rather than economic policy, making them harder to debate openly. Resetting relations, even partially, reopens space for scrutiny, negotiation, and public interest arguments. That does not weaken democracy. It gives it room to breathe. What is striking about this moment is how carefully it has been framed by both governments. There is no triumphalism, no declaration of a new era of friendship, just a steady emphasis on stability, predictability, and regular communication. That language tells you this is about risk management, not romance. It is about lowering the temperature without pretending the room is cold. And yet the broader lesson extends beyond Canada and China. We are watching a world where countries are quietly diversifying their options because the old guarantees no longer feel reliable. The United States still wields enormous power, but power used erratically invites hedging. When trade policy changes with electoral cycles and alliances feel conditional, partners look for balance elsewhere. Not because they want confrontation, but because they cannot afford dependency. The missing question in much of the coverage is not whether this deal is good or bad in isolation. It is what it says about the direction of global politics. Are we moving toward a world where countries build overlapping relationships to protect themselves from shocks? Or are we sleepwalking into blocks defined by pressure and punishment? Canada's move suggests a preference for the former, even if it makes some people uncomfortable. And that discomfort is the point. Moments like this force us to confront how much of our foreign policy thinking is driven by habit rather than outcome. They ask whether moral clarity requires permanent estrangement or whether engagement can coexist with disagreement. They expose how often ordinary people are expected to absorb the cost of geopolitical posturing while being told it is necessary for some larger good. As these agreements move from announcement to implementation, the real test will not be in press releases. It will be in whether tariffs actually fall, whether travel actually resumes, and whether channels of communication stay open when the next disagreement inevitably arises. Resetting a relationship is not a single decision. It is a series of choices made under pressure. And that is what makes this story worth watching, not because it resolves anything once and for all, but because it reveals how fragile the old assumptions have become and how urgently countries are searching for ways to protect their people in a world that feels less predictable by the day. That search for predictability is really the through line here, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment because it explains so much about the anxiety humming beneath these announcements. For decades, global trade operated on the assumption that disputes would be managed within relatively stable rules. You could disagree, even intensely, without assuming that access itself would be cut off. What has changed is not just who holds power, but how casually that power is now used. Tariffs appear and disappear with press conferences. Markets become bargaining chips. Entire sectors are told to absorb the shock for some higher strategic purpose. When that becomes the norm, governments that still see themselves as accountable to their citizens have to adapt. They cannot tell farmers to simply endure indefinite losses for the sake of abstract alignment. They cannot tell students that global education is a luxury that must be sacrificed to signaling. And they cannot tell workers that volatility is the price of moral seriousness. At some point, people demand outcomes, not narratives. This is why the agricultural piece of this deal matters so much. Canola is not just a commodity. It is an ecosystem of jobs, infrastructure, and regional identity. When access to China collapsed, the damage rippled outward. Storage facilities filled up, prices dropped, confidence eroded. Governments can talk all they want about finding alternative markets, but anyone who works in agriculture will tell you that markets are not interchangeable. Relationships matter, logistics matter, timing matters. Reopening that channel is not a symbolic concession. It is a structural repair. And it also reveals something about how China is repositioning itself. Beijing is not pretending it never used trade as leverage. What it is signaling now is that leverage can be recalibrated. Punishment is not permanent. Compliance is not the only exit. That message resonates with countries that fear being locked into endless retaliation cycles. It suggests that engagement still offers pathways back to normalcy, even after severe breakdowns. Of course, none of this erases legitimate concerns. Engagement does not dissolve disagreements over human rights, security, or governance. Those issues do not disappear because tariffs drop. The question is not whether to care about them, but whether permanent estrangement actually advances those concerns or simply hardens positions while hurting people with the least influence over policy. That is a question governments rarely answer honestly because the answer is uncomfortable. Media coverage often avoids this tension by collapsing everything into a binary. You are either tough or you are naive. You are either standing up for values or selling them out. That framing is emotionally satisfying but analytically empty. It ignores the reality that values do not pay mortgages and that economic collapse does not produce moral clarity. It produces resentment, instability, and backlash. There is also a deeper power story unfolding beneath the headlines. Middle powers like Canada are asserting a kind of quiet autonomy, not through grand speeches or dramatic breaks, but through incremental decisions that reduce vulnerability. Visa-free travel here, a tariff reduction there, a working group reactivated. Each move is small enough to avoid open confrontation, but together they signal a refusal to be locked into someone else's conflict logic. This is not a rejection of alliances. It is a recognition that alliances have limits when they are not backed by consistency. If the rules can change overnight, then diversification becomes rational. And once diversification becomes rational, the moralizing language around engagement starts to lose its grip. You can see this playing out beyond Canada. Across Europe, Asia, and the global South, governments are making similar calculations. They are hedging, balancing, and reopening channels that were once politically risky. Not because they suddenly trust everyone, but because distrust alone is not a strategy. It is a posture. What makes this moment fragile is that it depends on follow-through. Announcements are easy. Implementation is where things break. Tariffs have to actually come down. Visa systems have to actually work. Dispute mechanisms have to function when something goes wrong. If those pieces fail, cynicism returns fast, and the lesson absorbed will be that engagement was a mistake. But if it works, even partially, it challenges a powerful assumption that has dominated recent politics. The assumption that confrontation is the only serious posture and that diplomacy is a sign of weakness. Success would not prove that disagreements do not matter. It would prove that managing them does not require permanent escalation. The quiet irony here is that the people most likely to benefit from this reset are the least visible in the political debate. Farmers, students, researchers, small business owners, families split across borders. Their interests rarely drive headlines, but they are the ones who live with the consequences when foreign policy becomes theater. And that brings us back to the hidden story beneath the headline. This is not just Canada and China finding their way back to the table. It is a signal that the era of easy assumptions about who sets the terms of global engagement is fading. Countries are no longer waiting to be told how to behave. They are experimenting cautiously with how to protect themselves. The question is whether publics are willing to see that complexity or whether we will keep demanding simple moral scripts that leave ordinary people paying the price. Because the world being built right now is not one of clean lines and clear camps. It is a world of overlapping interests, negotiated risks, and imperfect choices. And learning how to live in that world may be one of the defining political challenges of the years ahead. One of the most striking features of this moment is how little public conversation there has been about alternatives. The debate tends to jump straight from confrontation to capitulation, as if there is nothing in between. That erases a whole range of tools that democracies once used routinely: conditional engagement, multilateral pressure, issue-specific cooperation, dispute resolution mechanisms that do not require humiliation or escalation. By reopening channels with China, Canada is not abandoning leverage. It is changing how leverage is exercised. Market access becomes something that can expand or contract based on behavior, rather than something permanently denied. Dialogue becomes a way to manage conflict rather than pretend it does not exist. That approach is slower, messier, and less emotionally satisfying than grandstanding, but it is also how most durable arrangements are built. There is also a cultural dimension here that often goes unnoticed. Years of hostile framing have narrowed how societies imagine each other. When the only stories that circulate are about threat and competition, empathy atrophies. Travel restrictions reinforce that process by making direct experience rare. Visa-free access is not just about convenience. It increases the chance that people encounter a more complex reality than the one fed to them by politics. Those encounters do not magically resolve tensions, but they do complicate them. A student who studies abroad, a researcher who collaborates across borders, a business owner who builds a partnership. These are small threads, but they weave a fabric that is harder to tear without consequence. That fabric is often the first casualty of geopolitical standoffs and the hardest thing to rebuild afterward. Critics sometimes argue that people-to-people ties are naive in the face of state power, but states are not abstract machines. They are shaped by incentives, pressures, and constituencies. When engagement creates groups with a stake in stability, it alters the political landscape in subtle ways. That does not guarantee better outcomes, but it changes the calculus. This is why the reaction to the Canada-China talks reveals as much about domestic politics as it does about foreign policy. For some, any sign of accommodation triggers fear of weakness. For others, any engagement with an imperfect partner feels like moral compromise. Both reactions reflect a deeper discomfort with uncertainty. It is easier to cling to absolutes than to navigate trade-offs openly, yet uncertainty is now the baseline condition. The global system that once absorbed shocks is fraying. Supply chains are being redrawn. Alliances are tested by domestic volatility. In that environment, insisting on rigid postures can be more dangerous than experimenting with flexibility. Canada's move suggests a recognition of that reality, even if it is expressed cautiously. What happens next will matter more than what was said in Beijing. If follow-through falters, critics will claim vindication. If implementation proceeds unevenly, skepticism will harden. But if the reset produces tangible stability without erasing disagreement, it will offer a counterexample to the idea that confrontation is the only serious stance. And that counterexample, if it holds, will not stay contained to one bilateral relationship. Other countries will notice. They already are. Each successful instance of pragmatic engagement makes it harder to argue that isolation is the only path to principle. The real question then is not whether Canada and China can get along. It is whether democracies can learn to pursue their interests without turning every interaction into a loyalty test, whether they can protect their people without outsourcing economic pain to the most vulnerable, and whether we as publics can tolerate complexity long enough to see if a different approach might actually work. Those are uncomfortable questions, but they are the ones this moment quietly puts on the table, whether we are ready to face them or not. This is Jacob Friedman signing off.
This is Jacob Friedman.